Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just observing Victorian London. We are cutting through the fog of history to analyze the very foundation of modern forensic science. And we're doing it through a genius whose name is pretty much synonymous with pure, cold intellect. Sherlock Holmes.
That's right. But to really understand the mastermind, you have to start with the man who made him famous.
The chronicler.
Exactly, Dr. John H. Watson. Our definitive entry point, that critical hook that launched this whole universe, is the moment they meet in A Study in Scarlet. It's a partnership born not really of friendship at first, but of necessity, convalescence, and just this stunning intellectual void in Watson's life.
So our mission today, then, is to really dissect that source material. We're going to pull out the key nuggets of knowledge that define Holmes's unique approach to the world, his eccentric rules, his specific science, and how his method of deduction actually works.
And how it's different from just simple observation.
Right. By the end of this deep dive, you will have a crystal clear understanding of the historical context of his genius and what separates the Holmesian approach from, just clever police work.
And crucially, we have to begin not with logic and chemical analysis, but with trauma. To get Holmes, you first have to understand the man who wrote it all down, Dr. Watson. His life before Baker Street was violent, catastrophic, and it left him perfectly poised, both physically and mentally, to accept the genius he was about to meet.
Okay, let's unpack that. When we first meet Watson in A Study in Scarlet, he is a man completely adrift, he's physically ruined, and as you said, intellectually starved. The source material goes to great lengths to detail his military career. So tell us about his service background.
Well, Watson starts as an assistant surgeon in the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers. His whole service is really rooted in colonial medicine and conflict. He gets to Bombay only to find out his corps has already advanced deep into enemy country because the Second Afghan War had just broken out.
So he's immediately behind, playing catch-up.
He is. He has to follow them through these dangerous passes, eventually reaching Kandahar, and then he's just plunged straight into his duties on the front line.
And the narrative really makes a point of telling us that the campaign brought him nothing but misfortune. He was removed from his own brigade and attached to the Berkshires.
And that's the move that put him directly into one of the most brutal battles of the entire conflict.
The fatal Battle of Maiwand.
That's the one, in July 1880. And this is where that defining physical trauma happens. Watson isn't just grazed, he was struck on the shoulder by a Jezail bullet.
And a Jezail, that's not your standard British rifle. This is something different.
Exactly. It's a long, large-bore musket, often locally made, and the wounds they inflicted were, well, they were devastating. The source is so specific, it says the bullet shattered the bone and grazed the subclavian artery.
Which is, that's a kill shot, basically. He's incredibly lucky to survive that.
He is. He writes that he would have certainly fallen into the hands of the murderous Ghazis, the local fighters, if it wasn't for the sheer devotion of his orderly, a man named Murray.
Right. Murray threw him over a horse.
Threw the unconscious Watson across a pack horse and somehow, miraculously, got him safely back to the British lines. The whole thing is just a testament to the brutal, chaotic reality of 19th century warfare.
But the suffering didn't end with the bullet. His body was already weakened by just being there.
That's the second layer of trauma, and it's often overlooked. Worn out by the pain and the general hardships, he gets transferred to the base hospital at Peshawar. And just as he's starting to get better, walking around the wards a bit,
He gets sick.
he gets struck down by enteric fever. The source calls it that curse of our Indian possessions.
Enteric fever. So we're talking typhoid, probably. A massive killer back then, usually from contaminated food or water.
And it implies months of just debilitating illness, high fevers, chronic weakness. For months, his life was despaired of. When he finally gets to the point of convalescence, he's so weak and emaciated that a medical board just instantly orders him back to England.
So this is the context for his arrival in London. He has a small pension, a ruined body, and just absolute soul-crushing boredom.
The source material is so explicit about it. Back in England, Watson finds his life objectless. His health is so poor he can't go out unless the weather is exceptionally genial, and he has no friends. He calls his life a monotony of my daily existence.
So when he's introduced to this eccentric figure, Sherlock Holmes, this psychological void just makes him incredibly receptive. He's already faced death and chaos. What he needs now is stimulation.
He needs a purpose. And for Watson, the mystery of Holmes himself becomes a kind of remedy for the scars of the war.
The introduction itself is famous, isn't it? It happens at St. Bartholomew's Hospital.
Right, in the chemical laboratory. His old colleague, young Stamford, is the one who connects them. And Stanford immediately signals how strange Holmes is. He looks at Watson, strangely, and warns him, "You don't know Sherlock Holmes yet. Perhaps you would not care for him as a constant companion."
That's a heck of a warning before you suggest someone as a roommate.
It is. Stanford calls him a little queer in his ideas, an enthusiast in science, a first-class chemist, but he's very clear he's not a medical student, which shows you just how narrow and self-directed his studies are.
And Stanford basically washes his hands of the whole thing, right?
He does. He says Holmes's nature is not easy to express the inexpressible. He's essentially saying, look, this is on you, which just emphasizes that Holmes exists outside of normal social rules.
And then comes the moment that's arguably the birth of forensic science and literature.
Holmes bursts into the lab, interrupting them, shouting, "I found it! I found it!" with a test tube in his hand.
And what he's found is huge.
It's monumental. We have to pause here because it's a really big deal for the time. He's isolated, a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and by nothing else.
So a definitive test for blood. In the 1880s, that was next to impossible. They couldn't reliably tell the difference between human blood, animal blood, even rust stains.
Exactly. This is a chemical certainty in an age of speculation.
Yeah.
And the delight on Holmes's face, it's like he's discovered a gold mine. It shows his passion isn't for fame or money, but for the precision of the method. He calls it the most practical medical legal discovery for years.
He immediately establishes himself not as a detective, but as an applied scientist.
But then, even more dramatic than that, is his immediate deduction about Watson.
The man standing silently in front of him, after shaking his hand, Holmes just says, completely out of the blue, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive."
And the shock is immense. Watson is floored. He writes that he sprang from my chair and stared at him in utter amazement. That one deduction is what fuels Watson's curiosity and makes him ignore all of Stanford's warnings.
So that deduction and the move to Baker Street, that solidifies the whole partnership. The apartments at 221B are described as desirable, comfortable, and the rent was moderate, which was important for two guys on tight budgets.
It's a move born of necessity, but it's the intellectual curiosity that holds them together. And Watson's initial observations start to build this picture of Holmes's unique, eccentric life. He's quiet, regular in some habits, rarely up after 10 p.m.
But then he's also often gone before Watson even wakes up, spending his days at the chemical lab or the dissecting rooms. Watson's basically living with a professional intellectual sponge.
He is, and he's determined to figure him out. He tries to create this catalog of Holmes's skills, which he calls the failed catalog, because it doesn't add up to anything recognizable.
Right, because the skills are so disconnected. What's on that list?
Well, there are the physical skills. He's an expert single-stick player, a boxer, a swordsman. He has a good practical knowledge of British law. But do those things make him a lawyer, a PE teacher, a chemist? It's impossible to categorize.
And then there's the music. He plays the violin well, but eccentrically.
Yes, Watson notes he'll play Mendelssohn if you ask him, showing he's competent. But when he's left to his own devices, he'd scrape carelessly at the fiddle with chords that reflected the thoughts which possessed him.
So it wasn't a performance, it was acoustic therapy, a way to stimulate his brain during intense thought.
Precisely. And his social connections are just as confusing to Watson. He knows people from the most different classes of society.
This parade of strange visitors.
A parade of them, the little sallow, rat-faced, dark-eyed fellow, introduced as Mr. Lestrade, a fashionable young girl, a gray-headed, seedy visitor, an old woman. This isn't a social network. It's a systematic information-gathering machine.
And all of that feeds into his unique philosophy of work. Holmes explains to Watson that he often solves cases without even leaving his room, unraveling knots that professionals like Lestrade can't, relying on a kind of intuition and a lot of special knowledge.
But here's the key psychological part. He's chronically bored. His greatest frustration is intellectual stagnation. He complains that there is no crime to detect, or at most some bungling villainy, that even a Scotland Yard official can see through it. He desperately needs complexity.
He wants to make his name famous, but only on cases that are actually challenging enough to be worthy of his skills.
Exactly. And because they're living together, Holmes is forced to sort of confess his more troublesome quirks. He warns Watson about his ship's tobacco and his chemical experiments.
But the most profound confession is about his mental state. The dumps, he calls them.
Right. He warns Watson, "I get in the dumps at times and don't open my mouth for days on end. You must not think I am sulky when I do that. Just let me alone and I'll soon be right." This is the profile of a mind that runs so fast that any period of inactivity feels like a debilitating depression.
And that mental acceleration, unfortunately, comes at a documented chemical cost. The source material is very direct about his use of stimulants.
Incredibly direct. Watson sees him with the needle and asks very bluntly, "Which is it today, morphine or cocaine?" And Holmes answers without any hesitation, "It is cocaine."
A remarkable detail for the time. Cocaine was legal, but this wasn't common.
Not at all. And his rationale is the key to understanding him. His mind rebels at stagnation. He says he can only do without artificial stimulants if he's given problems, the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis. He basically created his own profession because he's the only one in the world who does this, and now he's chemically dependent on having work to do.
It's a man who literally cannot tolerate the ordinary world, which brings us directly to the core of his method, the thing he has to explain over and over again, the difference between observation and deduction.
A distinction many people still confuse today. Holmes sees observation as, just passive fact gathering. Deduction is the active logical architecture you build on top of those facts.
He makes it sound like simplicity itself.
He does, and he demonstrates it constantly. Observation is just what the trained eye sees. Deduction is the inference you draw from that data, usually using some kind of specialized knowledge.
He uses that trivial example of Watson's trip to the post office. The observation is about the visible facts.
Right. In this case, Holmes notices the little reddish mold adhering to your instep. Then he applies his special knowledge. He knows that just opposite the Wigmore Street post office, the pavement's been dug up and there's earth of that exact reddish tint there. That's pure applied observation.
And then the deduction kicks in.
Which is the logic. He deduces, "I knew that you had not written the letter because they had been together all morning. I see also in your open desk a sheet of stamps and a thick bundle of postcards." So he eliminates general postal business. What could you go into the post office for then but to send a wire? Eliminate all other factors, and the one which remains must be the truth.
It's a perfect demonstration of how he builds certainty from what seems like nothing. It looks like magic, but it's just structured logic.
But the most dramatic and initially kind of painful demonstration for Watson involves an old family watch. This is where Watson actually accuses Holmes of cheating because the conclusion seems so impossible.
Watson gives him his deceased brother's watch. Let's break down Holmes's analysis here. First, the observation on the object itself.
He notes the lower part of the case is dented and covered in cuts and marks. His conclusion: the owner was careless and kept hard objects like coins and keys in the same pocket.
But then the deduction turns into this brutal character sketch.
It really does. First, the easy part. It belonged to Watson's eldest brother. But then he says the brother was untidy, threw away his chances, lived in poverty with occasional short intervals of prosperity, and finally, taking to drink, he died.
Now, wait. I have to challenge this just like Watson did. That feels like a huge leap. Linking dents on a watch to a specific addiction like alcoholism and ruin, isn't that more like storytelling than science?
That's exactly what Watson said. But Holmes justifies it by pointing to specific tiny facts. He explains the 5 distinct scratches near the keyhole.
What about them?
They were the marks of a pawnbroker's key. In Victorian London, frequently pawning an heirloom meant serious financial trouble, which was often tied to alcoholism. The watch being pawned and redeemed over and over again confirmed the pattern of brief prosperity followed by relapse.
So it wasn't just general wear and tear, it was the specific microsigns left by the apparatus of poverty, the pawnbroker's tools, which told a story of economic and moral decline.
Exactly. And this is where Holmes states his core belief. Detection can be brought as near an exact science as it ever will be brought in this world. He emphasizes that what's out of the common is usually a guide rather than a hindrance, and the whole point is to be able to reason backwards.
Which brings us to our first case study, the Brixton Road mystery, the first major case Watson sees, and it's the immediate test for this whole method.
It is. The client is Tobias Gregson, who was supposedly Scotland Yard's smartest, and he needs help with the murder of a man named Enoch J. Drever.
The scene at 3 Lauriston Gardens is immediately strange. An empty house, a well-dressed victim with no wounds, no sign of robbery, but marks of blood everywhere, and his face is just twisted in an expression of horror and hatred.
It's a puzzle that defies any simple motive.
Yeah.
And when Holmes arrives, he's like a surgeon. He sniffs the dead man's lips, he checks the soles of his patent leather boots, and then the police find a key piece of evidence, A woman's wedding ring rolls across the floor.
And Inspector Lestrade immediately jumps to the obvious conclusion.
"There's been a woman here," he shouts. And Holmes's response is just perfect. He says, "You're sure it doesn't simplify them?" He just dismisses the woman's scorn theory and focuses on the scientific facts the police have ignored.
Starting with the footprints. Despite the police trampling all over the mud, Holmes gets out his tape measure, and then he delivers this incredibly detailed description of the killer before anyone has a clue who he is.
The specificity is just stunning. He says the killer is a man more than 6 feet high in the prime of life, with small feet for his height. He wore square-toed boots, a specific style, and smoked a tricky Nepali cigar, which suggests a non-British origin or an expensive habit.
And the transportation clues are just as specific.
Unbelievably so. He came in a 4-wheeled cab, drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on his off foreleg. That detail is only useful if you have specialized knowledge of cab registers. He even adds that the killer probably had a florid face and remarkably long fingernails on his right hand.
How does he get that?
From minute scratches on the wall, signs of impatience. And he even reconstructs the crime's narrative just for the dust prints inside the room. He determines that Drebber, or Patent Leathers, and the killer, Square Toes, walked down the path together as friendly as possible.
But inside, something changed.
Inside, Patent Leathers stood still, while Square Toes walked up and down. He grew more and more excited, shown by the increased length of his strides.
That is a brilliant deduction, linking the physical length of a stride to the psychological state of agitation.
And he concludes, Drebber was poisoned, having detected something like bitter almonds on the man's lips. He also dismisses the word Raishi, written in blood on the wall, as a deliberate misdirection, a ruse.
So he sets a trap. He advertises the lost wedding ring to lure the killer back.
And the trap is sprung, but by an accomplice, a seemingly feeble old woman. Holmes follows her, but realizes she's actually a young man in disguise, an incomparable actor, who escapes by leaping from the moving cab.
Which proves the killer isn't working alone.
Right. Eventually, Holmes uses his network, the Baker Street Irregulars, to track down the specific cab driver, which leads them to the killer, Jefferson Hope, and Hope's confession. Well, it unveils this shocking Mormon backstory.
Which provides the motive for this whole elaborate crime. Drebber and his secretary Stangerson were part of the Holy Four, an inner circle of Mormon elders in Utah.
And Hope tells this tragic story about John Ferrier and his adopted daughter, Lucy. They were basically persecuted by the church, and Lucy was being forced to marry either Drebber or Stangerson. She refused.
So the avenging angels came after them.
Yes, the Danites. They left these countdown warnings on the wall. Ferrier was killed, and Lucy died from the ill treatment soon after. Hope retrieved her wedding ring, the one found at the crime scene, and dedicated his life to revenge.
And his method of killing Drebber in London was almost theatrical.
It was. He found him drunk, lured him to the empty house, and offered him a choice of 2 identical pills, one harmless, one deadly poison. Drebber chose the poisoned one.
And the second victim, Stangerson.
He tracked Stangerson to his hotel, offered him the same choice, but Stangerson attacked him. Hope was forced to stab him. So the whole case is this incredible marriage of cold science, the boots, the horse, the cigar, and this white-hot, passionate motive that stretched back decades.
Let's move to the second novel, The Sign of the Four. This one introduces a totally different kind of mystery, rooted more in colonial greed than trauma.
Absolutely. The client is Miss Mary Marston. Her father disappeared in 1878. 4 years later, after her Major Sholto died, she started receiving a single valuable pearl in the mail every year.
A bizarre silent gift that just screams secret.
It does. And she brings Holmes a curious paper her father left behind, a map. Holmes examines it and sees a building plan, a cross marked at a precise coordinate, a little hieroglyph of 4 crosses, and the title, The Sign of the Four, followed by 4 names.
Jonathan Small, Muhammad Singh, Abdullah Khan, Dost Akbar.
And Holmes immediately recognizes the context, which shows his specialized knowledge of India. The case escalates quickly when they go to see Major Sholto's son, Bartholomew. They find him dead in a locked room, his face twisted in horror, just like Drebber's.
But the clues here are even more bizarre.
They are. It forces Holmes to synthesize multiple fields of expertise. The wound is key. A poisoned thorn in his scalp, not an English thorn. The weapon is a strange stone-headed instrument.
And the entry method.
A hole in the ceiling, a rope, a heavy boot print. And most startlingly, the prints of a naked foot, scarce half the size of those of an ordinary man.
The genius here is how quickly he links all these disparate elements.
Instantly. He connects the tiny footprints to the poisoned thorn, which he deduces could only have been fired from a blowpipe. He identifies the accomplice as a diminutive savage from the Andaman Islands, Tonga. And the boot print belonged to a man with a wooden leg, Jonathan Small.
And to track them, he needs an infallible tracker.
So he gets Toby, a mongrel with an amazing power of scent. Toby tracks the pungent smell of creosote, a wood preservative left by Small's wooden stump. It's the application of chemistry and animal science to urban detective work.
The trail leads them to the docks and this spectacular high-speed chase down the Thames.
It does. And when they capture Small, his confession reveals the incredible story of the Agra treasure. He was a British convict in India during the mutiny. He and his 3 Sikh associates, the 4, found this legendary treasure after killing a merchant.
But he was arrested.
He was. Years later, he convinced Major Shalto and Captain Marston to help him retrieve it from the Andaman Islands, but they betrayed him. They took the treasure and left him in prison.
So this has all been about revenge.
It has. But Small's final act of revenge is the ultimate twist. After he killed Bartholomew Shelto, with Tonga's help, they stole the treasure. But during the boat chase, realizing he was about to be caught, Small threw the entire Agra treasure, all of it, into the Thames.
He scattered it over 5 miles of riverbed.
Yes. The entire complex case, all the murder and conspiracy, it resulted in nothing. The treasure is just gone, dissolved back into the city. Small valued his revenge far more than the profit.
The shorter cases we're about to touch on are so vital because they show the sheer flexibility of his method. He can pivot from chemistry to botany to social psychology in an instant.
They're a masterclass in varied forensic application. Let's start with the 5 orange pips. This case highlights the dark reach of an organization across continents. The warning sign, 5 dried orange pips in an envelope marked KKK, immediately tells you the stakes are incredibly high.
The Ku Klux Klan. Holmes recognizes the MO instantly.
He does. He knows they use pips or seeds as a structured warning. Victims had to either give up their old ways or flee the country. If they stayed, death would come in some strange and unforeseen manner.
And the timeline is deadly. Colonel Openshaw's death is ruled a suicide after the first letter arrives from India. His brother's death, an accidental fall, follows the second letter from Scotland. The third letter, arriving from London, means the danger is right there.
And Holmes's solution here isn't about footprints, it's about oceanic tracking. He uses archives and Lloyd's registers, the maritime directory, to trace the specific ship and captain responsible for carrying the message. It's a global manhunt from his armchair using large-scale data analysis.
Okay, next, let's dive into A Scandal in Bohemia. This is the one, isn't it? The only time Holmes was clearly beaten by a woman.
By the woman, as he forever called her, Irene Adler. The objective was purely psychological. Get back a compromising photograph she had of the King of Bohemia.
And his method was all about stagecraft. He disguised himself as a clergyman and staged a fake street fight using red paint to fake a head injury so he'd be carried into her house.
That got him inside. But the real ruse was the chemical rocket. He had Watson raise the cry of fire. Holmes knew that, under stress, a woman's instinct is to save her most valuable possession, and she ran right to the hiding spot.
A sliding panel above the bell pull.
Exactly. But Irene Adler was a trained actress with a first-rate mind. She saw through the ruse. And then she used his own technique against him. She disguised herself as a smart little lad, followed Holmes home, confirmed his identity, and fled the country, leaving behind a note. He was beaten because he underestimated her.
Let's move on to A Case of Identity. This one shows the importance of tiny details in mundane objects. A woman's fiancé, Hosmer Angel, just vanishes from a cab right before their wedding.
And Holmes deduces immediately that the fiancé is actually her stepfather, Mr. Windibank, in an elaborate disguise. The motive is pure financial control over her small income.
And the proof, the definitive proof, is a classic piece of document forensics. It's the typewriter.
The typewriter. The letters from Hosmer Angel were written on the same machine as Mr. Windibank's business letters. And the specific detail, the minute defect, was a slurring over of the E and a slight defect in the tail of the R. The machine was the non-lying witness, just like digital metadata today.
Finally, let's analyze the Red-Headed League. The deduction here is rooted in finding the motive for something completely absurd.
Utterly absurd. The client, Jabez Wilson, was given this ridiculous job of copying the Encyclopedia Britannica for £4 a week, but only between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m.
And Holmes operates on the principle that there has to be a rational criminal motive behind any absurdity.
He connects the dots by noticing the assistant's trousers are worn and dirty at the knee from crawling or kneeling, and that he's always disappearing into the cellar to do photography. The absurd job was just a distraction to keep the shop owner out of the way.
The solution is purely architectural. The assistant was tunneling from the cellar of the pawn shop to the vault of the bank next door.
And the league was dissolved because the tunnel was finished. The robbery was about to happen. The beauty of this case is that Holmes doesn't just solve the crime, he predicts it. He starts with the absurd fact and deduces the necessary criminal truth behind it.
What really stands out across all these deep dives is the sheer breadth of Holmes's expertise. Whether it's identifying 140 forms of tobacco ash, or his knowledge of military law, or his systematic tracing of footsteps and typewriters, the common thread is always the power of applied, systematic observation.
It really is. It's his ability to eliminate the sensational and just focus on the scientific. He links things that seem completely unrelated, like the 5 scratches on a watch to a man's downfall, or the smell of creosote to a fugitive's location. His discipline in eliminating every other possibility is the engine of his fame.
And we really can't overstate the Watson effect. Watson is so crucial, not just as a chronicler, but as the perfect foil. His own background in trauma and military life lets him appreciate Holmes's methods instead of just dismissing them.
And Watson's constant astonishment is our mirror. It lets us, the listener, really grasp the depth of the detective's powers. Without Watson's voice, Holmes is just a brilliant machine. With him, he becomes human.
It brings us back to one of Holmes's most profound statements, and it's something for you to take into your own life. He said, "Life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent. We would not dare to conceive the things which are rarely mere commonplaces of existence."
Think about that. Everything he uncovered, the Mormon revenge plot, the Agra treasure, the tiny flaws on a typewriter key, it was all hidden in the commonplace facts of everyday life.
So what commonplace facts in your life, the stuff marks on your shoes, a peculiar dust pattern on your windowsill, or a tiny unique scratch on your coffee mug might hold a hidden, explosive truth if you viewed them today through that lens of pure, systematic, Holmesian deduction?
Look closer. You might be surprised at what the seemingly ordinary facts truly reveal.
Something to ponder until our next deep dive.